Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, which is a joint venture by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. Our course is entitled Cultural Studies, and we are at the moment in module 3 entitled Sites. Today the topic of discussion in this class is ethnicity, race and nation. As always, let us do a recap of the last lecture. The last lecture was devoted to an important term in cultural studies, namely language, and there are reasons why I have placed language in module 3 devoted to sites, because language, as I had mentioned in the last lecture, is both a site and at the same time is constitutive of culture, even of cultural studies. Okay. So, we saw, as we look at the slide please, we saw that language is both a means and a medium for meaning generation. It ties into culture because culture too is about the generation of meaning through science. Okay. So, science and the semiotic system is what we have first in common between language and culture, so much so that language is said to be like a culture, culture is said to be like a language if not a language. Next, we read from Chris Barker, where he says that culture can be regarded as regulated maps of meaning, and that these maps are constituted by crisscrossing discourses through which any cultural practice or object may gain significance for us. Okay. The important term, however, is that these meanings, regulated maps of meaning, etc., are temporary sort of temporary coagulations of meaning, temporary mappings. They are never final, and that is the beauty of culture, that is the beauty of cultural studies, that meanings are never fixed, they are always fluid and flexible. As we said, culture therefore is like a language. Okay? It happens in language, and then that way it is language is also or may also be considered a site. Then to explicate it further, we found that there are similar mechanisms at work, okay, as far as language is concerned, as far as culture is concerned. Okay. The way it works is like the way it is similar is like this, in the sense that there are similar mechanisms at work in both language and culture, and these are the selection and organization of science. This is what we saw in the last lecture. Then we brought in through Barker the formulations of the philosopher Richard Rorty, who saw culture as also as conversation and gave a great primacy to language. Rorty and other philosophers of the same orientation, of the same formulations, okay, belong to the school of thought known as anti-representationalism, okay, which simply means that one cannot represent faithfully anything in this. Why? Principally because it is through the mediation of language, through the mediation of discourse, okay, limited by the limits of discourses, okay, only through these that we may perceive, we may comprehend reality. Okay. For instance, there is no God-like vantage point from which to survey the world and language separately in order to establish the relationship between them. Therefore, it also follows from the formulations of philosophers like Rorty etc., that one does not have any objective truths, and you will be interested to know that this so called objective truth and the fact that we cannot have these purely objective truths is also applied, okay, to science, right. This we will talk about later when we talk about science, culture and science, or science and technology in cultural studies. Therefore, we have only justifications, okay. We have only justifications where we initially thought or where it was hitherto thought that they were objective truths. Therefore, the positing of language as a free floating system rather than a human tool is the onus of such a way of looking at language, of considering language as a site of culture. Okay. Many feel that this decoupling of signification from practices, from habits and routines, there is a theoretical gap, okay, between signification and the material. And there was one point which I left out in the last lecture, and I will quickly include these here, which is a critique of the idea of language as wholly constitutive of culture. Okay. So, these are some of the problems, in the sense that there is, as we have seen here, as Barker says here, a theoretical gap between signification processes, practices and the and the material, and the what he calls the elevation of semiotic theory or the study of science over the linguistic competences of living persons. That is to see our a propensity to see people to see the abstractness of the system rather than really looking at its use, okay, by what he calls living persons. And so, there may be really an over concentration on codes and texts at the experience or at the expense of real people, or of people who make utterances in concrete situations, and people who are subjects, who are speaking subjects, okay, who perform these spoken acts within certain given circumstances. So, this is one of the most important critiques being brought up against the idea of language being culture being wholly constitutive of language. Therefore, the importance is on the utterances of persons in social context. Fine. So, after this brief recap, we are now going to go into there are three terms here really: ethnicity, race and nation. And we are going to look briefly at these, and why we have clubbed them together is something that is going to be clear as we speak about these. And this will also lead on to our next lecture, which is on globalization. Now, as always, let me declare the text to be used in this lecture, from which we will be gleaning most of the points, and at times even extracts from the text, which I shall be explaining to you from time to time. So, Chris Barker's Cultural Studies Theory and Practice is our key source. In fact, he devotes a whole chapter entitled Ethnicity, Race and Nation. Fine. Let us look at these three terms: ethnicity, race and nation. Now, many of you will realize that these terms, ethnicity, race and nation, are not terms that only belong to cultural studies. For instance, where do these terms also belong? Before coming into cultural studies, the domains within which these terms were used could be anthropology, sociology, political science, etc. Okay. So, you will recognize that or you have come across these terms, and our job here is to not to talk in the vocabulary or in the discourse of areas or disciplines like anthropology, sociology and political science. Okay. We are going to see how ethnicity, race and nation are looked at particularly from a cultural studies perspective. Okay. And the answer, the first a point that we need to look at, as Barker has shown us, is this, that all these terms, 3 terms within the discourse of cultural studies are considered under the concept of identity. You will recall that in module 2 we devoted a whole lecture on identity as a key concept, right. So, you see how these theoretical tools are going to be very useful for you as you try and apply these to other for instance to the sites that we have been talking about, or to to make it is very easy once you learn these concepts, right, key concepts, to apply these to various domains and areas. So, ethnicity, race and nation in cultural studies are seen as what? As forms of cultural identity. Okay. Next, now we shall look at the scope again, having said in the beginning that these 3 terms are considered as forms of cultural identity. We are going to unpack this, and we are going to look at it through Chris Barker's words, at the scope that is opened up, or the range of explorations that are there as far as studying ethnicity, race and nation is concerned within the rubric of cultural studies. First, the first point that is brought to us by Barker is this. This is the shifting, look at this, the shifting character of cultural understandings of race and identity in terms of representation. Okay. There are two things here. One is that race and ethnicity, we understand these through representation, and you will recall that we had talked about representation and the problematics of representation in I think over 2 lectures, if I am not if I recall, in module 2. Okay. So, Barker says that among the scope or within the range is A, studying race, ethnicity as as are available to us through representation, and secondly, he calls it not just representation, but trying to understand the shifting character. Let us look at this sentence again. He talks about the shifting character of cultural understandings of race and ethnicity in terms of representation. Okay. This is one of the ways in which you can sort of do studies of ethnicity, race and nation. Second, the cultural politics of race. It is not that the cultural politics of race or the politics of race, it is not that it is not, this thing is not, this aspect, it is not that it is not studied in sociology or anthropology or political science. Okay. So, again, as we kind of narrow down in a positive sense, and that is why I am trying to zoom into the most important feature of studying these within cultural studies is again cultural politics as a politics of representation. Okay. So, representation is the most important term here. How are ethnicities, how are nations, how are races represented to people, okay, and what is the politics of such representation. For instance, we know that from our lectures on representation, we know that representation is not ever neutral, okay, that there are issues of power, there are issues of politics, there are so many issues regarding the representation of any cultural form or product, right. So, the cultural politics of race, as I said, which may be an area of study in other disciplines, is seen particularly in cultural studies as a politics of representation. Next, the changing forms of cultural identity, okay, associated with ethnicity, right. So, again we have to understand that ethnic identity or even racial identity for that matter, okay, are never fixed, they are never kind of established once and for all. Okay. These, like their representations and their shifting characters, right, the claims, forms that ethnic identity takes, right, or ethnic identity will take from time to time, is always one that is changing. So, we also need to see, okay, apart from the politics of representation, apart from the shifting character of representation, we also include within the scope, right, of cultural studies of ethnicity, race and nation, how these forms of identity keep changing. Okay. Next, point number 4, the intersections between race, class and gender. It is not that we are to study or we are to explore these as discrete terms, right. Within ethnicity and race and even nationhood, okay, how are the variables like class, like gender, how are they to be accommodated, or how are they or how do they not fit in, and how do these variables crisscross, and what the dynamics are of such variables crisscrossing within the general within the general you would say panorama of ethnicity, of race and nation. This too is this too comes under the scope of cultural studies of ethnicity, race and nation. Finally, point number 5, the cultural legacy of colonialism. Obviously, colonialism is the most important factor, the discourses of colonialism, okay, the cultural constructions of colonialism, the representations of colonialism of different ethnicities, of different races, okay, of different nations, and those those areas of the globe that were not modern nation states, how even the legacy of colonialism contributed to the formation of the nation states. Okay. So, this is extremely important for you to remember that the cultural studies exploration of ethnicity, race and nation is not along discrete lines of what is ethnicity, what is race and nation. Okay. Even as they are studied together, there are other issues that come in which make it more complicated and more problematic, for instance, the issues of class and gender. Okay. Now, we shall see that as categories, right, as categories, terms like ethnicity, race and nation, okay, are discursive categories. They are discursive categories because their enunciation, their establishing, okay, and the continuities of their characteristics is made through different discourses about them. Okay. So, again it is also a matter largely of language, right. Next, they are performative. Performative, you came across this term when we look I think in the second lecture that was devoted to gender, part 2 of gender, when we talked about the feminist and the queer theorist Judith Butler, where she talked about gender being performative. Along the same lines, we may also argue that one's ethnic identity, one's racial identity, one's national identity is also a matter of performance. It is also performative in nature. How is it performative in nature? It is performative because, as we shall see a while later, it is considered performative because most of the cultural forms to do with ethnicity, race and nationhood are those that are images, okay, those that are symbols. Symbols, images that are invested with a lot of emotion, okay, lot of emotions of belonging to a particular ethnicity or ethnic group, or belonging to a nation or a race. Okay. So, they are performative in that sense. Next, we have already seen that they are identity constructing, okay. At the same time, even as identities are constructed, it does not mean that they are constructed once and for all. The important point to be noticed, and which we did note a while earlier, is that these identities are always getting constructed, that they are shifting and unstable, right. Apart from all these, one of the chief claims made by Barker here is that these categories of ethnicity, race and nation are nodal points. Okay. They are points of convergence, they are nodal points of identity and subjectivity. You can also say that these themselves in themselves are sites, okay, of identity and subjectivity. And identity and subjectivity being among the core key or key concepts in cultural studies, we may therefore claim that if identity and subjectivity are constructed, changing, are played out, are performed, okay, within the categories of ethnicity, of race and nation, which are cultural categories, then they are also, ethnicity, race and nation are also sites of culture, okay, where identities and subjectivities are constructed, dismantled and reconstructed. Okay. So, you see how I hope I have been able to show you how the study of race, ethnicity and nation differs in cultural studies, particularly when we compare these to studies, explorations done in the domains of anthropology, sociology and political science. Not that they do not overlap, there are overlaps, but as we have seen, considering these as discursive and performative belongs particularly to the methodology of cultural studies. Okay. Next, let us look at this slide, which is from where we begin to talk about ethnicity. Okay. Ethnicity is about sharing, okay, and we shall see here how many things are shared, right, by members of an ethnic group, or in the name of ethnicity. We see that members of an ethnic group share certain norms, okay. They share values, they are partakers more or less of the same belief system, okay. They have cultural symbols, okay, that are with which they are emotionally connected, okay, which hold a great deal of value, in which a lot of sentiment is invested. Okay. It is also, ethnicity is also about sharing cultural practices, different in everyday ways of living life. Okay. Myths are shared, particularly originary myths, for instance the origins of that particular ethnic group, where they came from, how they originated. Along with these, there are also myths of gods and goddesses that supposed to create of an originally homeland, okay, if once lost, to be revived, etc. Okay. Then blood ties, kinship and blood ties is also another important aspect that is shared by members of an ethnic group, and a homeland. Okay. So, a lot is shared within the framework of ethnicity, a lot is even loved, okay, and held dear within the framework of ethnicity. And we have come across these terms so many times in the last few lectures: myths, values, norms, cultural practices, cultural symbols, beliefs, etc., images. Okay? You see how ethnicity becomes a matter of cultural studies also in very important ways, right. Now, let us read, this is by Barker in his book Cultural Studies, Theory and Practice. Now, let us read what he has to say. Ethnicity is a relational concept. This is the first point to be noted. Okay? Ethnicity is a relational concept that is concerned with categories of self-identification, okay, and social ascription. Right? It is a relational concept because it's a matter of one being able to identify himself or herself with, as we say, all the shared cultural practices, images, symbols, beliefs, etc., where one can identify. That is why, remember, Barker had said early on in his chapter that ethnicity, race and nation are first and foremost matters of cultural identity. Okay? So, self identifications, when we can identify ourselves to, if not completely, to a huge extent with the different forms and products of our ethnic community, okay, we are performing, so to speak, an act of cultural identification and social ascription or of belonging to socially to that cultural group. Further, Barker says, thus what we think of as our identity is dependent on what we think we are not. This is very important. Okay? One, as a member of an ethnic group, it is not simply identifying with all these shared cultural products, right, of that we find in a community, but also understanding ourselves as different from the other, as different from he or she who does not belong to the ethnic group or ethnic community. Okay? That is why he says here, what we think of as our identity is not to be understood only as the presence of certain symbols or the sharing of certain cultural products, but also as not, or the absence of, okay, or as not sharing those that belong to the other group or another group. Right? Then he says, consequently, ethnicity is best understood as a process of, this is very important, boundary formation that has been constructed and maintained under specific historical conditions. Okay? So, look at how this is how this changes. Ethnicity is a relational concept, okay, in the sense that we can also relate, we can identify ourselves, okay, as belonging and belonging to a group, as partaking of all the things held in common, okay, by members of that group, and of social belonging. Right? Second, identity is, however, not simply a matter of presence or matter of identifying, right, with certain common values, phenomena. It is also that you understand yourself as the member of an ethnic group by seeing to it that your boundaries, right, the boundaries are maintained. Not difficult for us here to claim that much of ethnic, or some cases of ethnic conflict have to do with, with one's fear, right, that one's ethnic boundaries are being threatened. Now, by ethnic boundaries, by boundary formation in this matter is not simply boundaries of one's homeland or boundary or territorial boundaries, these are also boundaries of culture, right, in the sense of how we differentiate our cultural practices and products from another ethnic group. So, consequently, again, as Barker says, ethnicity is best understood as a process of boundary formation that has been constructed and it has been maintained. Right? It has been maintained under specific socio-historical conditions. Both the construction and the maintenance of these boundaries have been made under specific conditions. Right? Now, there are some important questions raised. For instance, many feel that the very word ethnic, the moment we say ethnic group, for instance, that it has to be what many use loosely, use a term loosely as a tribal group, or a marginalized group, or a group which is not mainstream. Some scholars very provoke us by posing questions like these: do whites form an ethnic group, okay, or in the usual acceptance of white as norm, as a white community, a white group as a norm, okay, do we come to believe eventually that the whites as a group are the point of reference, or they are the normative group? Can we say that whites form an ethnic group? Look at the slide here and see, the point made by these critics is that we should defamiliarize whiteness as norm, or as I just mentioned, as a point of reference. Okay? And they say that of course, we should study white societies as ethnic groups, and in studying white societies as ethnic groups, what do? We are going to look at what whites as belonging to an ethnic group share in terms of cultural practices, values, myths, cultural symbols, norms, etc. Even that is to be put, okay, to a cultural studies exploration. Now, further, again on ethnicity, this is what Barker has to say. One problem with the cultural concept of ethnicity is that some questions of power and racism may be sidelined. Now, race, ethnicity, these are terms that one may not use in place, one in place of another, but they are kind of they are kindred terms in certain ways. Okay? So much so that the moment we talk about race studies and the moment we talk about ethnic studies, it seems to some that moment we talk about race, it becomes race becomes a more belligerent side, race is more a site of oppression, or that race is more a site where where issues of power and issues of racial oppression are more foregrounded, right. That is why Barker says that when we culturally, from a cultural studies perspective, when we study ethnicity, it may seem to us, and perhaps it has been so, okay, that questions of power and racism even within ethnicity may be sidelined, right. Let us see how. This is what he says further. Ethnicity can be deployed to suggest that a social formation operates with plural and equal groups. This is very interesting. Okay? He says the term ethnicity, even as ethnic groups make border formations, even if they very zealously protect their own cultural and territorial borders. On the other hand, this term may neutralize several very important political and issues of power. For instance, ethnicity may be deployed to suggest that a social formation operates with plurality and equal groups rather than hierarchical racialized groups. Okay? It may seem misleading, misleadingly we may think that ethnic groups live in great plural harmony and pluralism, and that these are equal groups. Okay? Even within these, the issues of hierarchy and racialized groups may be sidelined, may not be foregrounded. Okay? Then Barker says it has also been suggested that it diverts, or ethnicity, the study of ethnicity as is done by some scholars, diverts attention away from racism and towards the cultural characteristics of racialized minorities. Okay? So, if you are there is a danger of talking about shared practices and sidelining or not foregrounding, right, issues of power. Okay? So, we will now come to race, which is the second word in our second category in our lecture today. And race, as has been noted by scholars, began as a biological discourse, okay? Particularly with the issue of skin pigmentation, right, dividing people into black, into white, yellow if you will. Okay. It began as a biological discourse where there were evident markers of physical differentiation, okay, in the population in the world, right. And what, look at this slide here please, what helped it was the appropriation of Darwinian theory, okay, in what today many call an unfortunate way of studying society, which is called social Darwinism. Okay. We are all aware of the theory of the principle of natural selection, and that is the bedrock of survival, of reproduction. These are the pillars of the thinking of Darwin, of Charles Darwin. Okay. The problem is when we kind of unproblematically and sometimes even irresponsibly borrow theoretical formulations made in the field of biology, okay, to press upon or to to throw light on issues that are human and cultural, right. So, race began as a biological discourse aided by social Darwinism, where they were the discourse included typologizing, it included making hierarchies, okay, drawing lines of descent, along with which it was all the more evident that discourses of power and subordination would eventually and almost naturally come into the picture, along with the very cruel realities of oppression. It is even said that there was a time in which the scientific, some members of the scientific community in Europe tried, or carried out, scientific research in a bid to prove that there were indeed important genetic differences between or among the races in the world, and to also make, as it is mentioned here, typologies, hierarchies of definitions of characteristics, which ultimately led to rendering some people of this world as being inferior to others. Of course, such kind of science is today debunked, and there is no evidence, so to speak, to hold or to enable anyone to argue today about important biological differences in the races, okay, among races that may show one to be inherently inferior, right. Now, again, this is what Barker says, and let us read it and then I shall explain it. Races do not exist outside of representation, rather they are formed in and by symbolization in a process of social and political power struggle. This is the shift we see, okay. Once we move away from the biological discourse, the discourse of biology with which the study of or the articulation of race began. When we move into cultural studies shows us that the matter of race, okay, is one, or issues or aspects of race is are those that are articulated through, again an important word, key concept, representation. They are formed in by symbolization in a process of social and power struggle. Thus observable, please look at this slide here, thus observable characteristics are transformed into signifiers of race. Okay. What was what was seen as something that could be marked physically on on a person, okay, which could be described physically, becomes by the time we have this course of cultural studies becomes one that is understood as signifiers, okay, as signifiers that signify, right, characteristics of race. This includes, as Barker says here, this includes the spurious appeal to essential biological and cultural difference. So, we see that it is both beginning with biology and now currently this engagement with signifiers, engagement with signifying processes or practices as far as the representation of race is concerned. We see that both the biological and the cultural differences are which says are spurious appeals to essential. This word is important, essential, which makes it an essential is that they essentially there are biological differences. Even if there were essential biological cultural differences, the problem happens only when you try to hierarchize these, when you try to render some of the differences as being characteristics and differences as being better or worse compared to another, right. So, aspects of contemporary racial discrimination. So, today moving on from the biological, the ways in which people of some races are discriminated against, particularly as Barker shows in this chapter, particularly in the Western world, is discrimination in terms of the labor market, discrimination in terms of housing market, discrimination in terms of education, of access to education, even the education system as a whole, and discrimination certainly in media and in cultural representation in different media forms. How races are they being stereotyped? Okay, are they being stuck, so to speak, on in one image, on one particular image? So, the contemporary is not that racial discrimination, as cultural studies practitioners prove and argue very radically, that racial discrimination exists today in these, particularly in areas of labor and housing market, in education and in media and cultural representation. Therefore, as Barker says, racisms the forms and realities of racism again are not homogeneous, right. This is very important. Within this broader rubric of race, we should be able to realize that the forms and realities of racism are not homogeneous. They are different in different times, in different spaces. Then there are different historical realities that lead to this change, or to this difference in the forms and realities. For instance, Barker shows here British Asians are stereotyped as doctors and shopkeepers, while young Afro-Caribbean men in Britain are cast in the role of criminals. Now, media I am sure one can find out instances of movies, of soaps, okay, where this kind of typecasting is done. Then further, the new racism in Britain relies not on biological discourses of superiority, as I said, that discourse is now fading, as in South African apartheid, but on cultural differences. Look at this, from cultural differences that exclude black people from being fully a part of the nation. And this is the word that we are going to end this part of the lecture with. Okay, we have studied the race, issues of race and ethnicity from a cultural studies perspective, and we are going to talk about the nation. Now, nation, as far as nation is concerned, how does it relate to race and ethnicity? Okay. Now, let us read here again. Race and ethnicity, according to Barker, have been closely allied to forms of nationalism that conceive of a nation as a shared culture. So, the common point among all these three is that like race, like ethnicity, okay, the nation is also something to do with an entity that depends on and is constituted by or constructed by a shared culture, requiring that ethnic boundaries should not cut across political ones. There are culturally formed, nation is culturally formed by contingent historical circumstances. Nation is never a given, and cultural studies insists, if you remember, that nothing is a given. It always has a history that has led to its formation, and there are contingent historical forces also in the construction of nation. Okay? And nation is the collective form of organization and identification. Okay. Therefore, nation may be looked may be considered in two levels. Okay. Now, let us look at this slide here. The nation is at once a political organization, and B, and not less importantly, nation is also a matter of cultural representation. Nation is also discursive, and nation is symbolic. Okay. It is not to deny the existence of a nation, but it is very important for us to realize here, to understand and even argue that a nation is a political organization. The nation has its national boundaries, all right, but at an equally important level, it is also about representation. Okay. It is also about understanding the nation, nationality, nationhood, okay, in terms of representation, and it is, in that sense, it is also constituted by discourse, and it is also constituted by symbols, right. Now, we shall see and end with this, we shall see how this happens. So, in the discourse of nation, the kindred terms are therefore nation, nationalism, nation states, and national identity. So, the nation is understood therefore in terms of, like ethnicity, in terms of a certain origin, okay, which is to be held up by all the members of the nation, of a certain tradition that again is to be to be respected, right, by members, and the continuity, that there is a continuity between past and present, discursively therefore, okay, and also symbolically, right, the origins, tradition of the of the past and the continuity with the origins and tradition is what also gives credence, apart from the political organization, apart from the territorial boundaries, to our understanding of nation. Therefore, if a nation state is a political concept, right, referring to administrative apparatus and territory, national identity is a form of imaginative, now this is an important word, imaginative identification with the symbols and discourses of the nation state. So, remember, we have to understand these two things, sort of contrapuntally being there. There is the territory, there is the administration, it is a political entity, but at the same time, okay, this would not have been possible, or do this, for instance, the continuity with tradition and origins, this would not have been possible had there not been what he calls here the imaginative, one's imaginative understanding, even emotional attachment with the symbols and images and representations of nationhood. Stuart Hall, now this is Stuart Hall's formulation is brought to us by by Barker, and let us read from here. Instead of thinking of national cultures as unified, we should think of them as a discursive device which represents difference as unity or identity. Okay, they are cross-cut by deep internal divisions and differences, and unified only through the exercise of different forms of cultural power. So, even the nation is not to be seen as a given, even in terms given by Stuart, that Stuart Hall says here importantly, we should think of nationalism, national cultures as a discursive device, right. Finally, we will end with a reference to a very important book named or entitled Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson, and I am sure some of you are aware or acquainted with this book. The whole idea of nationalism, of nationhood, okay, is one, according to Benedict Anderson, that is constructed through one's imagination, okay, through one's collective imagination, and he uses the term imagined communities to describe nation or nationalism, nationhood. according to Anderson, let us look at this slide here. According to Anderson, the nation is an imagined community where national identity, okay, emanates from a narrative of shared symbols, images, symbols and rituals. Okay. So belonging to a nation, we belong to a community, all right, but that is an imagined community. This point that we have talked about even earlier. It is an imagined community, and which is established through a narration. Remember, a narration has to be from the origin, through tradition and through claims of continuities of one's tradition, of a hallowed tradition even, and the identity. And we are now coming full circle in this case. We talked about race, ethnicity, etc. as matters of cultural identity, and even nationhood is a matter of cultural identity. And the narrative of shared origins, of tradition, of images and symbols is what holds this community of members of a nation together. Okay. One's national anthem, then one's one's national flag, okay, followed by all for instance, a different we also have a national flower, a national bird, and it is tea is being now touted to be the national drink. Okay. These are all these cultural forms and products that add, right, to the imagination of and add to the narration of a nation. In this sense, therefore, the nation is cultural, the nation is also abstract, okay, and the nation is imagined. So, we will quickly end with Anderson, who says here that the nation is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members. We will never meet them or even hear of them. In that case, how do we then identify as as brothers or sisters, if you will, of one country? Okay. That is why he says the nation is imagined. It is imagined because members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them or even hear of them, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. The nation is imagined as limited because even the largest of them, encompassing perhaps 1 billion living beings, has finite if elastic boundaries beyond which lie other nations. So, remember this, the other, the concept of otherness, the feeling of otherness, okay, is what is very important, not only in the case of ethnicity. Okay. Boundaries are important. Okay. We are what we are, what others are not, right. These defining by negation, okay, by negatives, is also extremely important, right. Then Anderson says it is imagined, the nation is imagined as sovereign because the concept was born in an age in which the Enlightenment and Revolution were destroying the legitimacy of the divinely ordered hierarchical dynastic systems. That which means that even the idea of nationhood is an idea of the idea of nation is one that has come through us. It was never there, okay, as a given, as a cultural or linguistic given. It was never there in our vocabulary. It is historically, it came about as a result of historically contingent events, right. And the Enlightenment and the different revolutions like the French Revolution, for instance, okay, these sort of ultimately led to carving out the idea of a nation. So, the idea of a nation, which of course in the minds of so many people is one to be protected, to be one that is hallowed, one that is to be loved, is shown by cultural studies as one that also has come about because of historical forces and is ultimately also a matter of symbolization, of representation, okay, and of identity formation. Finally, Anderson says nation is imagined as a community because regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is always conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. Okay. This is again trying to to sort of downplay the heterogeneity and of any nation, okay, within any nation, and to conceive it as a deep horizontal comradeship. Finally, ultimately it is this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many millions of people not so much to kill as willing to die for such what he calls importantly limited imaginings. Okay. A radical statement here, and you will understand it as even our desire to die for one's country is one that is discursive, that one that is constructed, right. So, I hope I have been able to to get these connections, right, and the connection between race, ethnicity, nation and the complexities also by trying to explain it through the chapter on ethnicity, race and nation by Chris Barker, and we will quickly look at 1 or 2 questions. What is the scope of studying race and ethnicity within the framework of cultural studies? It is that the shifting character of cultural understandings be seen in terms of representation, as the politics of representation, okay, and also cultural identity associated with ethnicity are to be seen as changing forms, okay, and the intersections between race, class and gender, these are also variables, and also importantly the legacy of colonialism. This is the scope of studying race and ethnicity within the framework of cultural studies. What are generally shared by members of ethnic groups? And we find that members of ethnic groups share many things. They are among them norms, values, beliefs, cultural symbols, cultural practices, myths, blood ties and the idea of a homeland. How is race studied within cultural studies? Race is studied in terms of symbolization and representation within cultural studies. Then we can get a question like, how is national identity a form of imaginative identification? The nation is not just a geographical identity with specific borders, not only simply nor is it simply or only a matter of political organization, but national identity, nationhood, nationalism are to do also and very importantly with the narrative of shared symbols, of shared images, okay, of symbols, rituals, of homelands, etc., which carry a lot of lot of emotional interpellation, okay, if you will, okay, and where we invest a lot of our emotions. So, thank you for being with me in this lecture, and we will move on. We have about 4 lectures, 3 or 4 lectures left in this module, and I shall see you very soon. Thank you.